The Tiger crushed shells and mines, but one overlooked flaw doomed it every time. Hidden underneath, for all its armor and fear, the Tiger still fell to a simple trick no one expected, the trick of wire. Engineers studied the Tiger for months until one man spotted what everyone else missed, a weak spot. German crews trusted the Tiger's steel, but that trust broke the moment this trap was used. Instant failure. The Tiger survived rockets and shells, yet a cheap battlefield tool stopped it cold. Just metal wire. It wasn't luck or firepower, it was engineering that brought the Tiger to a halt. In 3 seconds, the Tiger tank crawled forward through thick mud, its heavy engine echoing like thunder across the ruined forest. Soldiers nearby watched as the giant machine pushed trees aside and crushed debris under its weight. To most men, this sight meant danger was coming, but one engineer wasn't staring at the armor at all. He was studying its tracks, searching for the one weakness everyone else had missed. The engineer crouched low in the mud, eyes fixed on the Tiger's metal tracks as they twisted and clattered forward. Most soldiers feared the armor, the cannon, the sheer weight of the machine. But he wasn't looking at its armor at all. He was watching how tension built and released with every rotation, searching for the tiny mechanical flaw that the Germans never imagined someone would notice. Asterisk. As the Tiger advanced, the engineer motioned to nearby troops to stay low. He had studied captured Tiger manuals for weeks, reading every line Germans assumed no Allied soldier could understand. And buried deep inside those pages, he found a clue, a strange note about track strain during sharp turns. A clue that could change everything if tested in the field. The Tiger rolled closer, grinding over shattered branches. German crews felt untouchable inside, confident nothing outside could stop their thick armor. But the engineer focused only on the exposed wheels and tension bars. If his guess was right, the weakest point wasn't the armor, it was the precise moment when the tracks tightened under stress. He signaled to a rifleman carrying a simple spool of wire, a tool so ordinary it didn't look like a weapon at all. The engineer had tested this idea on smaller German tanks, but never on a Tiger. The theory was simple: force the tracks to bite into something they couldn't break. The challenge was timing it perfectly. One mistake and the Tiger would crush them all. The Tiger turret rotated slowly as the crew scanned the ruined treeline, unaware of the trap forming beneath them. The engineer whispered final instructions, unwinding the wire carefully so it wouldn't snag too soon. He needed the tank to pass over a very specific point, the exact angle where its track tension spiked. If he placed it too early, it would snap. Too late, and they'd never get another chance. The Tiger's engine roared louder as it pushed through the mud, its tracks carving deep grooves in the ground. The engineer studied every rotation, counting in his head. He knew the moment the tank shifted its weight, the tension rods would tighten sharply. That was the instant the wire had to catch. He signaled softly with his hand. The moment was coming fast. As the tank approached, the soldiers held their breath. The engineer stretched the wire across the rut, anchoring it around a broken tree stump. It didn't look dangerous. It didn't look like anything at all. But if his calculations were right, the wire would jam the track at its most vulnerable second. One clean catch and the unstoppable Tiger would suddenly stop for the first time. The Tiger's left track rolled forward, smashing twigs and branches under its weight. Mud kicked up behind it as the machine powered through the clearing. The engineer steadied his hands and watched the moment the tension rods snapped into place. This was the window, just a fraction of a second, where the wire could wedge perfectly between the guide teeth. He braced himself as the tank crossed the line. The instant the Tiger's weight pressed down, the wire whipped tight and disappeared under the track. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the metal screamed, a sharp grinding snap that echoed across the clearing. The track jerked violently, catching on itself. Soldiers ducked as chunks of mud flew out. The mighty Tiger lurched forward, slowed, and then for the first time it shuddered to a complete stop. Inside the Tiger, the crew scrambled in confusion. The driver slammed the controls forward, but the tank barely groaned and stayed locked in place. The commander shouted for a status check, but the gunner felt the vibration first, a harsh grinding pulse running through the floor. Something had jammed deep in the suspension. They didn't know it yet, but one thin wire had just crippled 45 tons of German engineering. Outside, the engineer motioned for the soldiers to stay low. A disabled Tiger was still deadly, its turret could swing, and its gun needed only one shot to turn the whole team into smoke. But he also knew the crew inside couldn't move the tank until they freed the track. That meant they had to climb out. He whispered, "Wait for the hatch. That's the moment we've got." The Tiger's turret rotated violently, searching for targets it couldn't see. The commander knew the tank wasn't responding and ordered the crew to check the track. The hatch slammed open and a mechanic jumped out, dropping into the mud. He crawled along the side, expecting a broken link, but what he found instead made him freeze. A simple wire wrapped so tight it had vanished into the metal. The mechanic shouted for tools, trying desperately to pry the wire loose. But every second wasted gave the engineers' team the advantage. The Tiger couldn't fire its main gun at targets this close, and the machine gun couldn't angle down enough to hit the men below. The engineer signaled his men to move. This was their only chance. The tank was helpless for the first time. As the German crew fought to free the track, the engineer's squad rushed toward the immobilized tank. Smoke and dust filled the air as rifles clicked off safety. The Tiger's crew finally realized what was happening and scrambled back toward the hatch. But it was too late. The engineers' plan, one simple wire, perfect timing, and raw courage had turned the battlefield upside down in seconds. Gunfire cracked across the field as the engineers' squad fanned out around the crippled Tiger. The tank crew tried to swing the turret, but the jammed suspension made the whole chassis shudder violently. Inside, every man felt the danger closing in. They were trained to fear artillery and mines, but not this. Not a thin wire that had turned their armor into a coffin that couldn't run. The engineer kept low, moving along the Tiger's blind spot. He knew German doctrine. If the crew couldn't move, they'd try to reverse and realign the gun. But the jam track made even that impossible. Mud churned, gears screamed, and the tank lurched just an inch. That tiny movement told him everything. The wire was still locked inside, holding the giant completely still. Inside the turret, the German loader shouted over the engine roar. Sweat rolled down his face as he cranked the elevation wheel, trying to angle the gun low enough to hit someone on the ground. It refused to budge any further. The Tiger was powerful, but it wasn't designed to engage enemies hugging its armor. Every weakness the engineer had studied was unfolding exactly as he predicted. The commander made the hardest call a tank officer could make, abandoning the vehicle. He slapped the mechanic's shoulder and pointed to the rear hatch. They needed to run before the Allies flanked them. But the moment the hatch cracked open, bullets snapped past, forcing them back inside. The engineer watched this from cover, knowing the Tiger crew was trapped by their own machine. Smoke curled from the Tiger's exhaust as the driver over-revved the engine in desperation, trying to break free. But the jam track only dug deeper into the mud. The tank tilted slightly, groaning like steel under strain. The engineer finally shouted the signal, a single sharp call. His squad surged forward. They weren't facing a monster anymore. They were facing a machine that had already lost. As the squad closed in, the engineer stayed focused on the immobilized track. He knew the Tiger's armor was too strong for small arms, but once a tank stopped moving, infantry controlled the fight. He checked the wire one last time, still dug deep, still binding the suspension. The machine that once terrified entire battalions was now helpless, not from firepower, but from a single overlooked flaw. A burst of MG-34 fire rattled from the Tiger's hull gun, chewing through branches and dirt. The squad dove for cover, pinned down for a moment. But the engineer noticed something the others missed. The gun's arc was limited. If they stayed low and shifted left, they were completely outside its reach. He motioned with 2 fingers, guiding the squad into the Tiger's dead zone. The tank couldn't follow. The commander tried again to open the hatch, desperate now. Smoke seeped into the turret, mixing with the smell of fuel and hot metal. He shouted orders the engineer couldn't hear, but the panic was obvious. A tank crew without mobility was fighting blind. The engineer steadied his breath. His wire trick had done more than stop the Tiger. It had broken their ability to coordinate or escape. The squad's bazooka team finally reached the flank, taking position behind a fallen tree. They didn't rush the shot. They knew the Tiger's armor was thickest at the front, weaker from the sides, weakest at the rear. And thanks to the jam track, the Tiger couldn't pivot to face them. The engineer raised his hand, holding it steady, then dropped it. The signal was clear: fire. The rocket streaked across the field and slammed into the Tiger's rear plate with a thunderous crack. Flames erupted from the engine compartment, smoke blasting through every gap. Inside, the crew scrambled toward the hatch again, but the heat drove them back. The engineer watched the Tiger burn, not with pride, but with the quiet understanding that he hadn't beaten the armor, he'd beaten the machine's design. The Tiger's turret finally stopped moving, frozen by heat and smoke. The engineer's squad approached carefully, weapons raised but steady. Even burning, a Tiger could still be dangerous. Ammunition might cook off, fuel lines could burst. The engineers circled wide, scanning for movement or a last-second counterattack. But the battlefield was quiet now. The machine that once owned the field was finished. One of the soldiers pried open the rear storage hatch, letting the smoke spill out in a heavy, dark wave. Inside the compartment, shattered tools and melted wiring showed exactly how violent the engine fire had become. The engineer crouched beside the wreck and studied the ruined track. His wire was still there, buried deep, fused into the metal. A simple idea that had destroyed a giant. Reinforcements arrived minutes later, staring in disbelief at the immobilized Tiger. Most had only heard stories of how hard it was to stop one in open terrain. Now they were seeing the truth. Even the strongest armor had weaknesses the designers never considered. The engineer didn't brag or explain. He just pointed to the jammed suspension and said quietly, "It only needed one mistake, one moment." As the smoke thinned, the squad gathered around the destroyed tank. The Tiger's silhouette, once a symbol of German supremacy, was now a burned outline against the tree line. The engineer wrapped the remaining wire back onto the spool, as if preparing for the next tank before it ever appeared. He knew this wasn't luck. It was physics, timing, and understanding how a machine behaved under stress. That day spread through the ranks fast. A single engineer had done what artillery crews struggled to achieve. His wire trick became a field tactic, copied and refined by units everywhere. Not because it was flashy, but because it worked. On the battlefield, the smallest idea can change everything. And sometimes all it takes to stop a monster is knowing exactly where it's weakest.